June 8, 1962. 2:47 p.m. 125th Street, Harlem. The summer heat pressed down on the sidewalk like a hand. Mayme Johnson stood outside the Apollo Theater, waiting for her husband's car. She wore a cream-colored dress, white gloves, pearl earrings. She didn't see Salvatore Sal Orsini until he was 3 feet away. Sal Orsini was a made man, Genovese family. He controlled 3 blocks of East Harlem gambling operations and answered directly to Vincent, the Chin Gigant. On this particular afternoon, Sal had been drinking. He'd been losing money, and he'd been told, again, to stay out of Harlem proper. But Sal Orsini didn't take orders well. What happened in the next 7 seconds changed everything. Not just for Sal Orsini, not just for the Genovese family, but for every Italian mobster who thought Harlem was territory they could take whenever they wanted. Because the elegant woman in the cream dress, she was Bumpy Johnson's wife. And Bumpy Johnson was the only black man in America the Italian mafia actually feared. But to understand why what happened next became legend, why old mobsters still whisper about it in social clubs from Brooklyn to Chicago, we need to go back. Back to where Bumpy Johnson learned the lesson that would define him. Power isn't about who can hit the hardest. It's about who can make you bleed without ever throwing a punch. October 31st, 1905. Charleston, South Carolina. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born to Margaret Moultrie and William Johnson in a world designed to crush him before he could stand. The year Bumpy was born, more than 100 black Americans were lynched. Jim Crow laws controlled every breath a black person took in the South. You could be killed for looking at a white woman, arrested for walking on the wrong side of the street, beaten for having ambition. Baby Ellsworth had a large bump on the back of his head, a slight skull deformation that gave him his nickname, Bumpy. The kids teased him, but that bump, it would become his brand, his signature, the thing people remembered. When Bumpy was 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. It didn't matter that Willie didn't do it. It didn't matter that there were witnesses. In Charleston in 1915, a black man accused of killing a white man had 2 options: lynching or prison. Willie chose prison, 20 years. Margaret Moultrie made a decision that night. She packed 2 bags, she took Bumpy's hand, and she moved the family north to Harlem, New York, where everyone said black people could breathe. But Harlem in 1915 wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage. Bumpy arrived in Harlem at 10 years old, a skinny kid from Charleston with an accent that got him beat up twice in the first week. The Harlem kids could smell soft, they could smell scared, and Bumpy smelled like both. He dropped out of high school at 15, started running errands for local hustlers. Small stuff at first, carrying packages, delivering messages, standing lookout. The work paid better than any legitimate job a black teenager could get in 1920. It was during one of these jobs that Bumpy met William "Bub" Hewlett. Bub Hewlett was a mid-level Harlem racketeer who controlled a storefront gambling operation on 140th Street. One afternoon, Bumpy, 16 years old, hungry, ambitious, walked right into Bub's territory and started running his own small dice game. Just him, a blanket and a set of dice on the sidewalk. Bub's enforcers came to move him. They expected the kid to run, maybe cry, definitely apologize. Bumpy looked up at them, counted his money, and said, "This corner pays better than yours. Maybe you should ask why." The enforcers were about to break his legs when Bub Hewlett himself walked up. Bub had been watching from across the street. He'd seen Bumpy's dice game pull more players in 20 minutes than Bub's storefront pulled in 2 hours. Bub didn't see competition. He saw talent. "You work for me now," Bub said. Bumpy looked him in the eye. "I work with people who respect me, never for anyone." Bub laughed. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like that without getting hurt. He hired Bumpy on the spot, not as muscle, not as an errand boy, but as a thinker. Someone who understood what made people spend money, take risks, trust you with their cash. That moment, standing on that corner at 16, Bumpy learned the first rule that would carry him through 5 decades. Intelligence earns respect. Muscle just earns fear. And fear without respect means everyone's waiting for you to slip. By the early 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had caught the attention of Harlem's most dangerous person. Stephanie St. Clair, Madame St. Clair, born in the French Caribbean, self-made millionaire, called Queenie by everyone who knew her, ran the most sophisticated numbers racket in Harlem. She banked over $200,000 a year. That's nearly $4 million in today's money. She owned property, employed hundreds, and she did it all as a black woman in a world run by white men and Italian mobsters. St. Clair didn't hire just anyone. She hired strategists. When she met 28-year-old Bumpy Johnson in 1933, she saw something rare. A black man who understood that power in Harlem wouldn't come from copying the Italians. It would come from being smarter than them. The Italians think violence is power, St. Clair told him during their first meeting. That's why they'll always need us, because we understand this community. We speak their language. We are them. Bumpy became her enforcer, but not the kind who broke legs and burned buildings. Bumpy was the kind of enforcer who knew your secrets, your debts, your family, your weaknesses. And he'd use every single one before he ever raised a fist. In 1933, Dutch Schultz, a violent, ambitious white gangster from the Bronx, decided he wanted Harlem's numbers game. Schultz didn't negotiate. He didn't make deals. He sent men with machine guns. He burned St. Clair's betting shops. He killed her collectors. The Harlem numbers war had begun, and it would teach Bumpy Johnson the lesson that would define the rest of his life. When you can't win with muscle, you win with your mind. And sometimes you win by making the enemy destroy itself. Dutch Schultz was a problem that couldn't be solved with bullets. He had more men, more guns, more money. The entire Jewish and Irish mob backing him up. When Schultz moved into a neighborhood, you either worked for him or you disappeared. But Bumpy Johnson understood something Schultz didn't. In Harlem, you couldn't rule by fear alone. You had to be part of the community. While Schultz's men extorted, Bumpy's operation protected. Schultz demanded payments. Bumpy offered loans. Schultz threatened families. Bumpy sponsored churches. Every numbers runner who worked for Bumpy knew, we're not the mob, we're Harlem. But strategy alone wouldn't stop Dutch Schultz. So Bumpy Johnson did something unprecedented. Something that would change organized crime in America forever. He went to the Italians. Spring 1935. Bumpy Johnson requested a meeting with Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the most powerful Italian mobster in New York. The man who just organized the 5 families. The man who controlled everything below 110th Street. Luciano's men laughed at the request. A black gangster wanted an audience with Lucky. It was insulting. But Luciano was curious. He agreed to the meeting. One condition. Bumpy came alone. No weapons, no backup. The meeting happened in a lower Manhattan social club. Bumpy walked in wearing a tailored suit, no fear on his face. 12 made men surrounded the table. Luciano sat at the head. You got balls, I'll give you that, Luciano said. Why should I give a shit about your war with Dutch? Bumpy sat down without being invited. Because Dutch Schultz is a problem for both of us. He's greedy, violent, unpredictable. He's drawing federal attention to all of us. And sooner or later he's going to want what you have. Bumpy continued. I'm not asking you to fight my war. I'm offering you Harlem, a partnership. We run the numbers, you get a cut. Nobody burns buildings. Nobody kills cops, and Dutch Schultz becomes your problem to solve." Luciano stared at him for a long time. Then he smiled. "You're either the smartest black man I've ever met," Luciano said, "or the stupidest." "I'm smart enough to know that you want Schultz gone just as much as I do," Bumpy said. "And I'm offering you a way to do it without a war." On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot dead in a Newark restaurant by Italian mob assassins. The hit was ordered by Lucky Luciano and the Commission. Dutch's organization collapsed within weeks. And Bumpy Johnson, he became the first black man in America with a working alliance with the Italian Mafia. By 1948, Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem, not through violence, not through fear, through intelligence, through respect, through being the bridge between black Harlem and the Italian families downtown. He ran numbers, gambling, loan sharking, but he ran them his way. Clean, professional, community-focused. If you were struggling, Bumpy gave loans with no interest. If your kid needed tuition, Bumpy paid it. If the cops harassed your business, Bumpy made a call. People called him the Godfather of Harlem. Not because he killed people, but because he protected people. That same year, Bumpy met a woman named Mayme Johnson. She was 34, educated from North Carolina, working as a teacher. She had class, dignity, strength. Mayme knew who Bumpy was. Everyone in Harlem knew. But she didn't see a gangster when she looked at him. She saw a man who cared about his community, who wore suits and read books and spoke 3 languages. They were married 6 months later in a quiet civil ceremony. "I didn't marry Bumpy despite who he was," Mayme would say years later. "I married him because of who he was, a protector, a provider, a man who understood that respect means everything." By 1950, Bumpy Johnson was at his peak. He had power, money, respect from both the black community and the Italian mob. He walked through Harlem like a king. Every restaurant comped his meals. Every club gave him the best table. Every cop looked the other way. He had built something unprecedented, a black empire in a white man's world. But empires built on alliances with the mob always come with a price. And Bumpy's price came due in 1951. Federal agents arrested Bumpy Johnson on conspiracy to sell heroin. The case was weak, the evidence circumstantial, but the feds wanted Bumpy Johnson gone. He'd become too powerful, too respected, too much of a symbol that black men could build empires independent of white control. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The verdict: guilty. The sentence: 15 years. Bumpy was sent to Alcatraz, the Rock, the most brutal federal prison in America, the place where they sent criminals they wanted to forget. Mayme Johnson visited him twice a month. Every visit the same routine. They'd sit across from each other in the visiting room. Bumpy would hold her hand, and he'd promise her, "This doesn't change who I am. They can lock me up, but they can't break me." Bumpy spent 11 years on Alcatraz, 11 years in a 6 by 9 foot cell, 11 years surrounded by the most violent criminals in America. But Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive Alcatraz. He studied it. He read philosophy, law, history. He taught himself to speak fluent Italian so he could understand what the Italian mobsters were saying when they thought he couldn't understand. He played chess, a lot of chess. And he discovered something. Chess was the perfect metaphor for power. The king is protected. The queen does the work. The pawns sacrifice themselves. And the player who thinks 5 moves ahead always wins. By the time Bumpy Johnson was released in 1963, Alcatraz had closed permanently. He was one of the last prisoners to walk out. He was 57 years old, gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but sharper than ever. The Harlem Bumpy returned to in 1963 was different. The Italian mob had moved in deeper during his absence. Heroin flooded the streets. The civil rights movement was exploding. Malcolm X was preaching black power at the corner of 116th and Lenox. Young black men were angry, organized, and tired of waiting. And the Italian families, they saw Harlem as conquered territory. Bumpy's old alliance with Lucky Luciano meant nothing now. Luciano was dead. Vito Genovese was in prison. The new generation of Italian mobsters, men like Vincent Gigant, men like Sal Orsini, they hadn't lived through the Dutch-Schultz War. They hadn't seen what Bumpy could do. They saw him as an old man, a relic, someone who'd been gone too long to matter. They were about to learn why that was a mistake. Salvatore Sal Orsini was everything the old Italian mobsters weren't. He was loud, flashy, violent. He wore gold chains, drove a red Cadillac, and he believed that respect came from fear. If people were scared of you, they respected you. Simple. Sal ran gambling operations in East Harlem for the Genovese family. He was a made man, uomo d'onore, which meant he was untouchable. You couldn't hit a made man without permission from the commission. And you definitely couldn't hit a made man if you were black. By 1962, Sal had been pressuring Harlem business owners to use his numbers operation instead of Bumpy's. His pitch was simple. Bumpy's old. Bumpy's finished. You work with me now or your business burns. Most people ignored him. Bumpy Johnson might have been in his late 50s, but he was still Bumpy Johnson. You didn't betray Bumpy, but Sal Orsini took the rejections personally. And when Sal drank, which he did often, he got aggressive. June 8, 1962. 2:47 p.m. Mayme Johnson stood outside the Apollo Theater, waiting for Bumpy's driver. She was dressed elegantly, cream dress, white gloves, pearls, a lady. That's how Mayme carried herself, with dignity. Sal Orsini walked past her with two of his crew. He'd been drinking since lunch. He just lost $500 on a horse race, and he was looking for someone to take it out on. He didn't recognize Mayme. To him, she was just another black woman on his street. Mayme stood near the curb, her purse in her hand. Sal walked too close, intentionally. His shoulder bumped hers. She stumbled slightly but caught herself. "Watch where you're standing," Sal said, loud enough for the street to hear. Mayme looked at him. "Excuse me." "You heard me. Move." Mayme didn't move. She straightened her dress. "This is a public sidewalk. I have every right to stand here." What happened next took 3 seconds. Sal Orsini, a made man in the Genovese family, a killer, a man who'd never been challenged by anyone, let alone a black woman, pulled his hand back and slapped Mayme Johnson across the face. The street went silent. People walking froze mid-step. A vendor selling newspapers stopped calling out headlines. Even the traffic seemed to pause. Mayme's head snapped to the side. Her pearls swung. A red mark bloomed across her cheek. Sal's crew laughed. "That's how you handle them," one of them said. Sal pointed at Mayme. "Next time, move when a man tells you to move." They walked away, laughing, loud, confident. Within an hour, every person in Harlem knew what had happened. A white mobster slapped a black woman on 125th Street in broad daylight. But it wasn't just any black woman. It was Mayme Johnson, Bumpy Johnson's wife. Julius, one of Bumpy's oldest lieutenants, was the one who told him. He walked into Bumpy's apartment on Lenox Avenue at 4:15 p.m. Bumpy was sitting at his desk, reviewing ledger books. Numbers, payments, normal business. Julius stood in the doorway, hesitating. "What is it?" Bumpy asked, not looking up. "Sal Orsini slapped Sister Mayme," Julius said, "on 125th in public." Bumpy's pen stopped mid-stroke. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. He looked up slowly. "Say that again." Julius repeated it, word for word. Bumpy stood up, put on his jacket, adjusted his tie. His face showed nothing. But everyone in that room understood. Someone had just made the worst mistake of their life. Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment for 3 hours. Didn't say a word, didn't make a single call. His men waited. Everyone in Harlem waited. Because everyone knew the situation. Sal Orsini was a made man. You couldn't touch him. Not without starting a war with the Genovese family. And a war with the Genovese family meant every Italian mob in New York would come after you. If Bumpy did nothing, he looked weak, finished. Every young hustler in Harlem would see him as an old man who couldn't protect his own wife. His empire would crumble within months. If Bumpy killed Sal, the Italians would kill him. Then they'd kill everyone who worked for him. Then they'd burn Harlem to the ground. It was the ultimate trap, a lose-lose situation designed to prove that black gangsters, no matter how smart, no matter how respected, would always be beneath the Italians. But Bumpy Johnson had spent 11 years on Alcatraz studying one thing: how to win when winning looks impossible. At 7:30 p.m., Bumpy made his first call to Vincent the Chin Gigant, Sal Orsini's boss. The phone rang 4 times before Gigant picked up. "Vincent, it's Bumpy." Silence on the other end. Then, "Bumpy, been a long time. Your boy Sal Orsini put his hands on my wife today." Another pause, longer this time. "I heard. That was unfortunate." "Unfortunate." Bumpy's voice stayed calm, measured. "Your made man slapped my wife in the middle of 125th Street, in front of 50 witnesses, and you're calling it unfortunate," Gigant sighed. "Bumpy, you know the rules. Sal's made. He's under our protection. If you touch him—" "I'm not calling to ask permission to touch him," Bumpy interrupted. "I'm calling to tell you what's going to happen next, because there are rules, Vincent. And one of them is respect. Your boy violated that rule, so now I get to respond." Gigant's voice hardened. "Be very careful what you say next." "I'm not going to kill Sal," Bumpy said. "I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to make him irrelevant." Gigant laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. "And how exactly are you going to do that?" "By reminding every Italian in New York that Harlem isn't yours. It's mine, and it always has been. Your boy wanted to flex in MY neighborhood. Fine. Now I'm going to show everyone, including your own people, why you needed me in the first place." Bumpy hung up before Gigant could respond. What Bumpy did next took 2 weeks. No violence, no threats, just intelligence. First, he identified every Harlem business owner who'd been paying protection money to Sal Orsini. 12 businesses, all of them black-owned, all of them terrified. Bumpy visited each one personally. Same message: "You don't owe Sal Orsini anything anymore. If he comes back, you call me. Nobody puts their hands on my community." Within 3 days, Sal's weekly take dropped from $3,000 to $180. Second, Bumpy reached out to his remaining connections in the Italian families, men he'd worked with before Alcatraz, men who remembered the old alliances. He reminded them of something they'd forgotten. Harlem wasn't worth a war. It never had been. The numbers racket was profitable, yes, but it was messy. It required community trust. It required local knowledge. It required someone the neighborhood respected. The Italians had muscle, but Bumpy had something they couldn't buy: legitimacy. Third, and this was the genius move, Bumpy leaked information to the feds about Sal Orsini's East Harlem gambling operations. Not Harlem, East Harlem, Sal's home territory, the places he actually controlled. Within 10 days, federal agents raided 3 of Sal's biggest betting shops. They seized $40,000 in cash, arrested 6 of his collectors, and suddenly, Sal Orsini wasn't a rising star in the Genovese family. He was a liability. Vincent Gigant called Bumpy back 2 weeks after the slap. "You made your point," Gigant said. "No," Bumpy replied. "I taught a lesson. There's a difference. Tell Sal he's done in Harlem. He sets foot on 125th Street again and I won't call you first. Gigant didn't argue, because Bumpy was right. Sal had become more trouble than he was worth, but Bumpy wasn't finished. Because making Sal irrelevant wasn't enough. Sal needed to understand, viscerally, permanently, what it meant to disrespect Bumpy Johnson's family, and that required one final move. June 24th, 1962. 7:00 p.m. Sal Orsini received a message. Bumpy Johnson wanted to meet, in person, alone, at Rao's, a small Italian restaurant in East Harlem. Sal laughed when he heard. The old man wants to apologize, good. He's finally learning his place. But Vincent Gigant told him to go. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. You created this mess, Gigant said. Now you're going to clean it up. You listen to what he says, you apologize. And you stay the fuck out of Harlem. Capus, Sal went, but he went armed. A .38 revolver in his waistband, just in case. Rao's was neutral ground, a place where business was handled quietly. The owner, Anthony, greeted Sal at the door with forced courtesy. Sal knew Anthony was scared. Good, he should be. Bumpy Johnson sat at a corner table, back to the wall, cup of espresso in front of him. He wore a dark suit, white shirt, thin black tie, no visible weapons. Calm, Sal walked over, confident, loud. All right, old man, I'm here, let's get this over with. Bumpy didn't stand, didn't offer a handshake. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit, Sal hesitated, then sat. He leaned back, trying to look relaxed, but his hand drifted toward his waistband. Bumpy noticed. You won't need that. You put your hands on my wife, Bumpy said, matter of fact, no emotion. Sal shrugged. She was in the way, I told her to move. You slapped her. So what, she's a, Sal caught himself. Even drunk and arrogant, he knew not to finish that sentence. Bumpy took a sip of his espresso, set the cup down gently. Do you know what respect means, Sal? Yeah, it means people know not to fuck with you. Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. No, that's fear. Respect is different. Respect means people choose not to fuck with you, because they understand what you're capable of, because they've seen you keep your word, because they know deep in their bones that crossing you has consequences they can't survive. Sal scoffed. Is this a lecture? Because I didn't come here for. You slapped my wife in front of 50 people, Bumpy interrupted. Not because she disrespected you, but because you wanted to feel powerful. You wanted to prove you could do whatever you want in Harlem. You wanted to humiliate her, and by extension, humiliate me. Sal's jaw clenched. What are you going to do about it? Bumpy leaned forward. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word landed like a hammer. I'm not going to kill you, Sal, because killing you would start a war, and wars are expensive. Messy, bad for business. Instead, I'm going to do something that'll hurt worse. Sal tried to look tough, but his hand trembled slightly. I've already destroyed your operations in Harlem, Bumpy continued. You'll never collect another dollar there, but I didn't stop there. I reached out to the feds, gave them information about your East Harlem spots. By now, you've probably heard about the raids. $40,000 seized. 6 of your guys arrested. Sal's face went pale. You ratted. I didn't rat, Bumpy said calmly. I strategized, there's a difference. See, the feds were already watching you. I just pointed them in the right direction. Completely legal, completely untouchable. Bumpy stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, looked down at Sal. Here's what's going to happen next. You're going to apologize to my wife, in person, in public, on 125th Street, same place you slapped her, same time of day. And you're going to tell everyone within earshot that you made a mistake, that you disrespected Mrs. Johnson, and that you're sorry. Sal's voice cracked. Vincent will never allow. Vincent already agreed, Bumpy said. I talked to him yesterday. He knows you're a liability now. You cost his family money, attention from the feds, and respect. You're lucky he's letting you live." Bumpy walked toward the door, then stopped, turned back. "And Sal, if you ever put your hands on another black woman in Harlem, I won't call Vincent, I won't call the feds, I'll handle it personally. And you won't see me coming." He walked out. Sal sat alone at the table, shaking, humiliated, defeated. Without throwing a single punch, Bumpy Johnson had done what no other black gangster in America had ever done. He'd made a made man kneel. June 26, 1962, 2:45 p.m. 125th Street. Sal Orsini arrived in a borrowed car, not his red Cadillac, a modest sedan. He wore a simple suit. No gold chains, no flashy watch. He looked like a man attending his own funeral. Word had spread. Everybody knew Sal was coming to apologize to Mayme Johnson. Barbers closed their shops to watch. Street vendors abandoned their carts. People hung out of apartment windows. The Apollo Theater marquee crowd swelled to 200 people. Mayme Johnson stood in the exact spot where she'd been slapped 16 days earlier. Bumpy stood 3 feet behind her, silent, watching. Sal walked up, stopped 5 feet away. The crowd went silent. "Mrs. Johnson," Sal said, his voice cracked. I disrespected you. I put my hands on you. That was wrong. I'm sorry." Mayme didn't respond immediately. She let him stand there, sweating, waiting. Then she spoke, her voice clear, dignified. "Apology accepted. Now leave Harlem and don't come back." Sal turned and walked away, fast. Like a man running from a fire, the crowd erupted, cheering, clapping, people shouting Bumpy's name, but Bumpy didn't celebrate. He simply took Mayme's arm and walked her to their car. Within hours, the story spread beyond Harlem. Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, New Jersey, every Italian social club, every black neighborhood. Everyone heard the same thing. Bumpy Johnson made a made man apologize, in public. For the Italian mob, it was humiliating. A violation of everything they believed about power and hierarchy. For Black Harlem, it was a victory. Proof that intelligence could defeat violence. That respect could be demanded, not just earned. That being black didn't mean accepting disrespect. The incident became legend. Old mobsters still talk about it. The day Bumpy schooled the Genovese family without firing a shot. And Sal Orsini. He was transferred to Florida 6 months later. Demoted. Forgotten. He died in 1971 from a heart attack. Nobody came to his funeral. The years after the Sal Orsini incident were Bumpy Johnson's final act. And he played them perfectly. He reconnected with Malcolm X, who'd moved back to Harlem. The two men had history, mutual respect. Malcolm was fighting for black dignity through politics and religion. Bumpy was fighting for it through economic power. Different methods, same goal. Malcolm would later say, Bumpy Johnson understood something most people don't. Real power isn't taking from your community. It's protecting your community while building something they can be proud of. Bumpy sponsored youth programs, paid for funerals, protected local businesses from both the mob and corrupt cops. He became more than a gangster. He became a symbol. But the world was changing. The civil rights movement was forcing America to confront racism. The Black Panthers were arming themselves. Younger hustlers were dealing heroin, something Bumpy had always refused to touch heavily because he saw what it did to the community. By 1967, Bumpy was under federal indictment for drug conspiracy. The evidence was weak, the case circumstantial, but the government wanted him gone, again. His health was failing, heart problems. The stress of 60 years in the life was catching up. Doctors told him to slow down, rest, let someone else take over. Bumpy refused. I'll rest when I'm dead, he told Mayme. July 7, 1968. Wells Restaurant, 2249 7th Avenue, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual table with three old friends. They were eating dinner, talking about the old days, laughing about schemes that worked and schemes that didn't. Bumpy ordered fried chicken, collard greens, and rice, his favorite meal. At 10:16 p.m. he clutched his chest. His face went pale. He tried to stand but couldn't. His friends called for an ambulance. Bumpy Johnson collapsed at the table. He was pronounced dead at Harlem Hospital at 10:47 p.m. heart attack. He was 62 years old. Mayme was at home when she got the call. She didn't cry immediately. She sat quietly for a long time. Then she whispered, "He always said he'd go out fighting. I guess the only thing tough enough to beat him was his own heart." Bumpy's funeral drew over 5,000 people. The line to view his casket stretched 6 blocks. Italian mobsters came, politicians came, civil rights leaders came, street hustlers came, teachers, preachers, janitors, and jazz musicians came. Everybody came. Because Bumpy Johnson belonged to Harlem, and Harlem belonged to him. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, but his legend never did. The New York Times ran his obituary. It called him one of the most notorious criminals in Harlem's history. But the people who actually knew him called him something else. The Godfather of Harlem. His life has been portrayed in films. Denzel Washington played a character inspired by him. Forrest Whitaker played him in the TV series Godfather of Harlem. Rappers reference him. Historians study him. But the real legacy of Bumpy Johnson isn't in the movies or the music. It's in the lesson he taught. You don't need to be the loudest to be the most powerful. You don't need violence when you have intelligence. And respect isn't given. It's earned through protecting your own. Dr. Clarence Taylor, historian and professor at Baruch College, said this about Bumpy. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also a protector. He understood that in a world that didn't protect black people, somebody had to. And he chose to be that somebody, even if it meant living outside the law. Frank Lucas, who worked under Bumpy before becoming infamous himself, said, "Bumpy taught me everything, but the most important lesson was this: never let them see you as just muscle. Make them see you as essential. Make them need you. That's power." Mayme Johnson lived until 2009. She spent her final decades writing about Bumpy, defending his legacy and making sure the world knew her husband wasn't a monster. He was a man who fought a system designed to crush him, and he won more than he lost. In her memoir, Harlem Godfather, she wrote, "People ask me if I was scared being married to Bumpy. I tell them the only thing I was ever scared of was losing him. Because despite everything, the violence, the danger, the life, Bumpy Johnson was the most honorable man I ever knew." Here's what the story of Bumpy Johnson and Sal Orsini teaches us. Power isn't about violence. It's about options. Sal Orsini had one option: hit first, hit hard, make people scared. That's brute force. It works until you meet someone smarter. Bumpy Johnson had a dozen options. He could have killed Sal, started a war, burned down East Harlem. But he chose the option that hurt the most without spilling a single drop of blood. He made Sal irrelevant. That's the difference between gangsters and legends. Gangsters think in days. Legends think in decades. Sal Orsini slapped a black woman in 1962 because he thought he could. Because the system told him he could. Because centuries of racism and mob power told him black people didn't matter. But Bumpy Johnson reminded everyone, the mob, the feds, Harlem, America, that respect is earned. That intelligence beats muscle. And that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones with guns. They're the ones with minds sharp enough to never need them. There's a photograph of Bumpy Johnson from 1965. He's standing on 125th Street, hands in his pockets, fedora tilted. Behind him, you can see the Apollo Theater marquee. In front of him, three men in suits, Italian by the look of them, talking to him with deference. That photograph captures everything about Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't just standing in Harlem. He was Harlem, and everyone, black, white, Italian, Irish, everyone knew it. The slap heard round Harlem became the apology that changed organized crime. Not because Bumpy Johnson was the toughest, but because he was the smartest. If you want more untold stories of power, respect, and the people who changed the game without changing the rules, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the smartest move you've ever seen someone make without throwing a punch? And remember this. In a world obsessed with who can hit the hardest, the real winners are the ones who never have to swing at all. Until next time, stay sharp.